The theme of this last week's stories with infectious disease is that we have an implementation problem. I was reading a cover story in Time magazine about the Ebola outbreak in the DRC in Uganda, and a quote in it struck me. Basically, the quote said that we have more genomic tools, monoclonal antibodies, vaccine science, you name it, to fight infectious diseases, yet we continue to have outbreaks that can be seemingly worse than ones historically, which tells you that this isn't a science problem. Science has developed the ability to master some of these problems. What we have is an implementation problem. You can look at the Ebola numbers for this week, and I'm going to get to that in a second. We've got tools, but the virus had a major head start because it went unnoticed. It had unchecked spread, and our tools are being outpaced by this virus. On top of that, now you have a Marburg outbreak in Uganda, which has 20 cases of Ebola itself to contend with, and it's happening at the same time, which tells you that we really are not resilient to these filovirus outbreaks as a species. And it's not for lack of trying or lack of tools. It's because we don't actually do the work to fend these things off. Switch to Washington. The vaccine policy fights that continue to go on shows you exactly concretely what it's like when policy actively fights the science, actively tries to hinder the science instead of enabling it, allowing it to flourish. So I'm going to move into the stories for this week. And the first one is the Ebola outbreak in the DRC. This is basically the best resource in Ebola response on record, meaning we know so much about Ebola. This is the most recent Ebola outbreak. We've got so many tools to understand Ebola, but yet the outbreak is outrunning it. The case counts and deaths are around 1,300 plus, with 360 deaths. We have spread to a fourth province in the DRC, which borders two other countries like the Central African Republic and South Sudan. So there is real risk of other countries getting involved in this outbreak. When you look at the cases, the majority of cases that they find of Ebola can't be linked to a known contact, meaning that these are unknown chains of transmission. They're saying that there are Ebola patients that have been diagnosed that are missing entirely. What does that translate into? It translates into more transmission, harder to extinguish. Burial teams continue to face one of the most dangerous jobs on the planet. They have violence from communities that don't want their burial ceremonies disrupted or altered, and they're handling bodies that have very high viral loads around the time of death that have a transmission risk. We're seeing Ebola treatment units attacked. People are being killed at Ebola treatment units. This is also a failed state problem. There is no rule of law there. There is no respect for individual rights there. So you have people getting killed in Ebola treatment units. So as much as this is a virological problem, it's also a failed state problem. You see economic modeling now putting the worst case scenario at several $1 billion. If this spreads further, this is going to lead to GDP losses, more people in an impoverished country, in an impoverished region of a country being pushed below the poverty line, which tells you that outbreaks, epidemics, they have cascading impacts. They don't just stay in the health sector. They impact the entire economy, the entire way of people's lives, because the economy at base is people's lives. One bright spot is that there is a clinical trial that's starting now. The first patient, at least the first patient, has been enrolled. This is testing remdesivir plus a monoclonal antibody from MAP Biopharmaceuticals. It's going to take some time to get a readout, but I think the enrollment itself is a milestone. So I think that when you think of the bottom line of where we're sitting in this Ebola outbreak, we basically have an outbreak that costs more, both in lives and in dollars, than the available science should allow. That's an implementation problem. So moving now to vaccine policy and politics. We basically have a federal health department that is at odds with its own evidence, the courts, doctors, and also the public increasingly pushing back, which is a good thing. So what happened this week? The Second Circuit affirmed that New York schools can require vaccines as a condition of entry. This isn't a mandate in the coercive sense. A public school system setting its own safety-based entry requirements is no different than a public transit system setting its own safety rules. This is going to be appealed to the Supreme Court, and I don't know where that will land, but it's good that the Second Court basically says that schools need to be run safely. Deborah Horry, a former top CDC physician who resigned heroically in protest after Susan Menares was unjustly fired by RFK Jr., was on CBS's Face the Nation. And she stated something that we all knew, that RFK Jr.'s position is completely unmoored from science and reality. He basically has a fixed religious belief about certain things relating to vaccines. And no matter what type of evidence you see, he's always going to go back to his emotional kind of the emotional pull that anti-vaccine rhetoric, the unnaturalness of unvaccines has on him. So no matter what type of evidence you try to give him to try to help him navigate whatever decisions he has to make, it's not going to matter. He's impervious to evidence. Senator Cassidy, who was the physician senator who casted one of the deciding votes to advance RFK Jr.'s nomination, basically saying that, yeah, RFK Jr. broke promises to me. I don't know how naive or stupid he thinks people are, but everyone knew that RFK Jr. was going to break promises because he doesn't actually know what truth is. What is truth? Truth is a correspondence with reality. He doesn't actually believe in reality, obviously, because we've seen what he's been doing for decades. So RFK Jr. making a promise is nothing. That's not anything. That's just words like a parrot. So I don't know why Senator Cassidy seeks to try and justify basically a pandering action that he took, and one which he was justly voted out of office for. But no one actually believed RFK Jr. except for politicians who were trying to curry favor with the administration. A good news story is that in Florida, they're trying to get rid of the difficulty that people might have to get a vaccine exemption to go to school. And there was a bill to try and make it easier for people to get exemptions, making the requirements less. And it basically seems to be dead in the state legislature, which is a good thing, that the vast majority of people, including people from both parties, do support vaccine entry requirements for schools. And there's this group of people that we don't hear much about, that I read about this past week, called the malleable middle. People who hold a few vaccine myths in their mind, but are genuinely persuadable. I don't know exactly how you reach these people. Some people suggest using techniques like motivational interviewing to try and understand what's driving it. But it's exactly who the anti-vaccine movement targets hardest, by spreading disinformation. So that window of that malleable middle may continue to close. And I think when you look at what's happening, I've mentioned all this stuff going on in Washington and courts. The fight is playing out in courtrooms and cable news and all of that. But the underlying science, that vaccine saves lives, that vaccines are an incredible human innovation, that hasn't moved an inch, despite what's going on in Washington and in courthouses. I'm going to move on to Marburg now. So Marburg is a filovirus. It's in the same viral family as Ebola. It has no medical countermeasures against it, just like the Bundibugyo strain of Ebola. And it's kind of being layered onto an active Ebola response. There's at least one confirmed case in an 18-month-old child. There's some report of a second case. It's kind of nebulous right now how many cases there are in Uganda. But the fact that it's in an 18-month-old child tells me that this probably means that there are other cases, because toddlers aren't going to be the people who usually are the first cases of a Marburg outbreak. There likely was somebody that had interaction with the bat, interaction with bushmeat, something like that. So there's an unidentified chain of transmission. Uganda is a country that can handle Marburg outbreaks. They're generally well equipped. We've seen them pretty much contain their Ebola outbreak at 20 cases. It just really speaks to the fact that these things continue to come at our species. But I think what we will look for in the next week is what is the real case count? What's the response burden going to be like on Uganda? And we'll have to see how that all plays out. I now want to turn to measles, and I'm going to talk not just about the US, but also Bangladesh. And I think that Bangladesh is a place where what shows you what happens when population immunity collapses. And it's not just a virology story. So Bangladesh in 2025, just 1 year ago, had 125 cases. Now they have over 100,000. There was a massive administrative failure, a lapsed immunization program under an interim government, some lack of coordination with UN agencies. But what it wasn't was a viral or a biological change. The same underlying principle applies everywhere, though, not just Bangladesh. When population immunity drops, measles will take that opening, whether that's in Bangladesh or whether that's in Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania's Secretary of Health, in a recent interview, called for a magic bullet, that she wished that there was a magic bullet to deal with the measles outbreaks in our kind of banner year in Pennsylvania. There already is one. It's a vaccine. But it's not magic. It's the product of a reasoning mind applying science to a problem. And I think that's what people need to recognize, that we don't need magic bullets. We need scientific bullets, and they exist. In Pennsylvania, Delaware County, which is adjacent to where World Cup games are playing, wastewater surveillance, which is very valuable, is showing measles in the wastewater at least twice. But there's no cases reported in Delaware County, which tells you that there probably are more cases than are reported in Pennsylvania. Measles, you have to recognize, is the default. It will always occur unless people take action. You need active, sustained vaccination efforts. And if you don't have those, communities will get measles. It is circulating all around the globe. Elimination, which we likely are going to lose, is a constant achievement. It's not a resting state. It has to be dealt with actively. You have to do this all the time. You cannot have a passive response, or you can't have a negative response. So when you think about a country going from 125 cases to over 100,000 in a year, Bangladesh, this really shows you that how badly implementation can ruin a country, how much it can disrupt lives, where you have in Bangladesh hospitals that are inundated and a population worried about their children's lives. I'm going to move now to tick-borne disease. And I think there's a lot of promise there. We have a real vaccine finally close. Uptake is going to be a problem. And there's a little bit I want to say about chronic Lyme disease. So we've been talking about the fact that this is a banner year for tick bites, that emergency department visits are very, very high. And I think that's something that's been in the headlines a lot. And it's been tied to a new Pfizer Lyme vaccine that's in the pipeline. It's not approved yet. It's in its late clinical development. It has about a 75% efficacy. And one of the drawbacks of it is that it requires multiple doses. It's not perfect. It's meaningfully better than nothing. And you have to remember that this is coming in the wake of a first-generation Lyme disease that was pulled from the market years ago over lawsuit threats and low uptake. There was an article by Kaiser Family Foundation interviewing one of the highest risk groups for Lyme disease, hunters. And they seem to be hesitant. Some of them still seem to be hesitant. So that tells you that there's a lot of work to do, that even people who know the threat of Lyme disease are hesitant to take this vaccine. Maybe that's because it takes multiple shots, maybe because it's only 75% efficacious. We'll have to see. There are other Lyme countermeasures in the pipeline, monoclonal antibodies that people could get at the beginning of a tick season and protect them. There are certain pills that you might be able to take that makes your blood toxic to a tick, which kills the tick prior to its ability to transmit Lyme, because that takes a day or two. The other things about tick-borne disease that I think are important to keep in mind is that tick-borne disease is present year-round. You're hearing it in the headlines now because it's up, but that doesn't mean that there are no tick bites in the winter. And there was a study in Illinois looking at their rates of tick-borne illness, and basically they occur year-round with the exception of babesiosis, which isn't present in the colder months. Another tick-borne infection that gets less press but is important is Powassan virus. This is a tick-borne encephalitis, which means inflammation of your brain. So in 2015, there were 7 cases. In 2025, 76. Does that mean more people are getting it? Better diagnostics? It's unclear, but that is an important one also to keep in mind. Spread by the same ticks that spread Lyme disease. Lastly, I wanted to mention something about post-treatment Lyme disorder, what people call chronic Lyme disease. It is a real symptom complex, but it's really important to remember that we have multiple studies that show that this isn't caused by a persistent bacterial infection, meaning prolonged antibiotics aren't going to help. And you've got this very profitable, evidence-free treatment cottage industry that's grown up around these patients, where they do things like give people hyperbaric oxygen. And now you have RFK Jr. wading into this with his Lyme disease initiative. And he may end up giving legitimacy, I think he probably will give legitimacy to some of these people who do charge patients for hyperbaric oxygen therapy or get them certain radios to do certain radio frequency to try and blast the bacteria. All of this kind of stuff is likely going to get a spotlight because RFK Jr. has waded into it. Why? Because he doesn't care about science. He doesn't care about reality. He doesn't know what that is. Lastly, a fun story. I read a story in NPR in Nigeria that they have a game which is kind of a takeoff of Chutes and Ladders, the children's game, called Schisto and Ladders. What's schisto? Schistosomiasis. This is a parasitic disease, a neglected tropical disease. You get it from water. Snails are an intermediate host. This is a game for kids to play in order to learn about what you need to do to prevent yourself from getting schistosomiasis, which means staying away from contaminated water, taking anti-parasitic medications when you need them, cleaning up around water so that there's not high grass where the snails, which are the intermediate hosts, can thrive. Interesting, cool story. Maybe I'll get my hands on one of those games. So as we close this week, I want to just reiterate that there's a common thread that runs through most of these stories. The DRC isn't struggling with Ebola because nobody understands Ebola. Bangladesh didn't see a major measles outbreak because the virus suddenly changed. Uganda's Marburg response isn't a mystery waiting for some major scientific breakthrough. And the debate over vaccines in the United States isn't fundamentally about what the evidence shows. The science exists. The technologies exist. What determines the outcome of these outbreaks is whether societies can identify threats, build institutions, maintain trust, deploy resources, and apply what they already know. That's an implementation problem. Again and again, infectious disease reminds us that knowledge alone isn't enough. Human reason creates vaccines, diagnostics, treatments, public health systems, but those tools only matter when people choose to use them. You can have the best toolbox in the world, in history, but if you don't know how to use it, or refuse to use it, or basically lock it away so nobody can use it, you're basically no better than our ancestors who didn't have these tools. Remember, the microbes are never going to stop working. The question is whether we will.